The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. On today's episode, we are joined by Dick Bakker, Director at the Ottawa Renewable Energy Cooperative. Dick Bakker has been actively involved in the renewable energy industry since 2002 and a vocal advocate of all renewable energy options for many years. He has been operating a microfit solar system since June 2010 at his property in Manotick Station and recently installed a solar net metering system at his home. Dick has 20 years of sales and management experience in the telecommunications industry with companies such as Telestat Canada and Cisco. Now let's get into the episode with Dick. Welcome back, Dave.
Lysandra, it is great to be back, and I am so sorry that our good colleague from the UK, John Pooley, is ill today, so it's just you and me, so let's see what we do. It's going to be another great podcast.
Hopefully we don't stir up too much trouble without John, but we have an exciting guest today. Today we're joined by Dick Bakker, Director at Ottawa Renewable Energy Cooperative. Welcome, Dick.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Now, to kick off today's episode, could you start by introducing the Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op and the role it plays in the energy industry today?
Okay. With pleasure. So the Ottawa Renewable Energy Cooperative, or OREC as we call it, is a for-profit cooperative. We're a business that operates under the cooperative governance structure, one member, one vote. We try to do business with our members, but we're not allowed to in Ontario because of various electricity rules, which we won't get into right now. That may change with some of the lobbying work that we're trying to do. But right when we were formed in 2010, we were created at the same time as the Green Energy Act, and they formed a special kind of cooperative that would use community money to invest in renewable energy projects in their neighborhood. And that's what we were set up to do. So we started out as the Ottawa Renewable Energy Cooperative within the boundary of Ottawa and quickly realized that the grid wasn't designed for Ottawa, it was designed for the province. So we expanded to Eastern Ontario. Now we can do projects anywhere in Ontario. So we accept members from anywhere in Ontario, and we do projects. We can do projects anywhere in the province, but we tend to focus where we live. So Eastern Ontario, most of our projects are within Ottawa. 2 of them are in Eastern Ontario, Alfred Plantagenet, Hawkesbury, and 2 are in Southwestern Ontario, 2 wind projects that we have in Bruce and Huron County. We have 1,070 members, 34 projects, 27 solar, 2 wind, and we did 5 energy retrofits. 3 of them are still in operation. We've raised money through 11 offering statements over the years. We're now preparing our next one. We've raised over $14 million from our members. We have very little debt with banks. We pay a dividend and capital back to our members. So we're effectively a utility owned by the community that operates in a pension fund type of manner. We're in a long business. Electricity is a very long, capital-intensive business. We raise that capital from our members and pay it back to our members as much as possible. So our motto is to keep the jobs, electrons, and profits as local as possible.
Based on that experience, what role do you see community-owned renewable energy projects playing in grid decentralization over the next decade?
A big role. Electricity is a political game. It's a business, but it's more political than it is a business in the sense that, especially in North America, we have relatively inexpensive energy and relatively highly subsidized energy in funny ways. The Ontario Electricity Rebate Program is costing the taxpayer over $5.5 billion a year right now in Ontario. Accelerated depreciation, all sorts of things. Electricity is low, and we are going into an energy transition for various reasons, not just because of climate change. The old way of doing things is going to be more and more expensive. Big centralized power plants far away from where the consumption is just too expensive. The big power plants are marginally a little cheaper, but that doesn't offset the fast growing costs of transmission lines and distribution lines and the risk of tornadoes or storms or floods breaking those lines. I live in Eastern Ontario. We have a couple of very thin lines from here to the nuclear plants. which generate 60% of Ontario's electricity. So I'm only going to talk about electricity in the Ontario context. Energy is a bigger issue than electricity, but we are moving increasingly to an electrified energy supply. Oil and gas will be there forever, but in a decreasing amount. And electrification is just going to grow in every sense because it's so much more efficient and easier to move around if you have the wires. So anyway, I think I didn't quite answer your question. What's going to be the role of renewable energy co-ops? And that, I think, is to get people on side with the transition. Energy cooperatives are the most apolitical way to do that. Conservative farmers in rural Ontario can support, they understand what a co-op is, how it runs as a business, and how people can influence and drive the direction of that co-op. Urban Canada doesn't as well. Some of the biggest food processors for farmers, dairy production, dairy processing, are cooperative businesses owned by those agricultural companies, farmers, fishermen, etc. Cooperatives are better known as a business in the community in rural Canada than in urban Canada. And all political parties can support it because it's money staying in the community.
Dick, I'm so glad you're joining us. For our listeners, Dick and I had an opportunity to meet at the Sustainable Finance a few months back, and we ran into each other at a breakfast session. I am so pleased to hear because I agree. I think your model will be the future of the industry. I think we have a historically great energy ecosystem, but the growth required will be fast and furious. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure the current business model, the way it is set up with utilities, will be able to move the speed of what's required. So I actually think it's a great option and alternative to utilize your business model. So I'm glad you're here so we can talk to you about that. My question to you is, when you look at cooperatives like yours, how do you address the equity and accessibility challenges, not only in rural, but also in urban settings? How does that fit and assist that group?
I'm going to try to give a short an answer to that as possible. The big challenge we have is the regulations in Ontario that restrict certain things. Another gentleman that works with us, Roger Peters, the first president of OREC, has been writing our lobby documents to advocate for things like community solar and community regulations that allow for consumers to buy the power that's on their building or in another building and wheel it through the grid. The grid today in Ontario is set up to provide as low cost power as possible from centralized power plants. And everybody buys from the provincial grid, or all the utilities buy from the provincial grid. And people are not allowed to participate fully in that. Consumers are viewed as buyers only, without agency, without control. So we have been trying to work with housing co-ops in this area to put solar on the roof of a building, let's say a housing co-op that has 35 units. This is a specific example. In Ontario, if you put solar on a roof of a building, you can only credit that generation to 1 meter. If there's 35 units with 35 Hydro Ottawa meters, that cannot be done. It has to go to 1 meter. And that 1 meter is not going to have enough consumption to match the generation. You're not allowed to export more power than you consume. If you do export more power, you don't get credit for it. So nobody will put a solar system on a multi-unit residence because they can't allocate across the units. But that's a perverse regulation that makes it more expensive for tenants, housing co-op people living in housing co-ops, condos, shopping centers. Those are big roofs that could be used to drive down the cost of importing electricity into this corner or any corner of the province. And it makes it more expensive for the people in those units because they have to buy relatively expensive power from far away that has line loss, degradation. They can't take advantage of solar on the building to drive down that cost and thereby afford heat pumps, proper insulation, et cetera, et cetera. The specific housing co-op that we've been talking to the most about this would like to do a major energy retrofit and fund part of that from the savings of solar on the roof. Get rid of the window shaker air conditioners in the windows that people have put in themselves. So solar on the roof does one thing, but it enables many other things. And this perverse regulation against virtual net metering on the same premise is just an accounting change. And Hydro Ottawa, actually, the president of Hydro Ottawa 2 years ago sent a letter to the minister saying, please change this. We will do the manual accounting changes. But the minister said, give us time. We're working on virtual net metering rules. We're 3 years later and nothing's happened. So we're picking up that ball again.
Your response lines up with the next question. What policy changes would you enable to faster scale this community-owned projects, not whether it's Ontario or across Canada? I think you indicated one, but is there any other policy changes that would really enable this to manifest, not only to create this renewable generation, but as you said, it appears that there's other benefits in the retrofit side that allows this to happen too, which is a benefit to everyone concerned. So can you share with us what those might be?
So there's something called behind the meter, in front of the meter. So behind the meter is on the customer's premises, and in front of the meter is on the grid side. Behind the meter, the thing I just described, net metering. So solar on a project and the generation allocated to multiple meters on that premises. So that's one version of virtual net metering. Another one behind the meter is community or virtual net metering. So community solar garden. So a system owned by 50 or 100 people, and the credits go to those people separately. Every disaster recovery site, hockey rinks, churches, schools, should have the roof covered with solar, should have a battery on site with an automatic transfer switch, so that in a disaster, people can go to that facility, get heat and warmth, and charge their phones. And during the rest of the year, during the 99 years that there isn't a disaster, that facility is earning an income and exporting power to the grid, and thereby balancing the local grid and exporting more than its own consumption. It's earning a small but predictable profit for 99 years for the 1 month or 2 months where there is a crisis, when it islands and it's a recovery site. So we're not talking about the fancy words of virtual net metering and virtual power plant. It's a disaster recovery site in a community that is an island in a crisis. I live in a fairly well-to-do area of Ottawa called Alta Vista. We have a lot of trees. I've been out of power in my house for more than 10 days, 4 times in the last 30 years. The trees in Ohio in 2003 that fell over and shut down North America, the ice storm in 98, the Derecho in 2001, I think, or 2, another tornado that came by, didn't hit my street, but it hit 2 streets over and knocked out most of Alta Vista. So those are 4 examples in Alta Vista where we were out of power for 10 days. That disaster recovery site, virtual power plant, where multiple homes on their own are generating solar and releasing that solar with batteries at a time that is related to what the grid needs in that area, or reducing their consumption to match that. So it's multiple sites in a region that are coordinating with the grid on a real-time basis, so to deliver power into the grid or to reduce their consumption. There's a company in California called Dome Connect that does that. There's a company in Britain called Octopus that has a product called Racken. The Canadian Pension Fund just purchased a share of that. So our pension funds are investing in virtual power plants, whereas we can't do it in this province. And Ontario specifically has 30,000 microfits that are going to start coming off contract in 2029. Those would be ideal for virtual power plants in different areas. That's something the OREC is starting to. We want to talk to all the microfit owners in areas where we have fit contracts so that when those things start to come off the contract, we can pool them with ours. Not allowed in this province. Then there could be behind the meter suppliers to the grid who are then trading that with other people down the road or in the neighborhood. These are 5 specific things that we've talked to the minister about. In front of the meter, on the grid side, there could be batteries with a wind turbine and 5 acres of solar pods spread around. That is much more useful to the grid than a 10 megawatt solar farm at one corner of the region on the transmission lines. I come from a farming background south of Ottawa. During the ice storm in '98, there were farmers with rifles protecting their gas generators to make sure they could milk the cows in the morning. By having a wind turbine or 2 at the north end of a field, 8 acres of solar, and a battery, you are then producing power during the daytime, more in the summer, producing power at nighttime with the wind, more in the winter, and a battery to levelize all that. So that can be on a lower voltage power line on the distribution side. Do that in 10 locations. The wind distribution and the cloud distribution in day and night will vary. They will balance one another off, as opposed to 150 acres of solar in one corner. Community solar gardens, shared pods of facilities, and then virtual power plants, as we talked about earlier. So there's 8 or 9 specific things that we have talked to the province about.
Just for our listeners, they may not be aware of this because of the so-called energy transition, where effectively what you're doing is reducing the amount of fossil fuels, whether it's gas, propane, diesel, whatever that might be, and you're electrifying. And so what that means is there'll be more electricity required. And so in Canada, where we're located, we will need to increase our grid across Canada, and it will vary depending on where you are in Canada, by at least 2 to 3 times from what it's currently at. And that is monumental as far as not only arranging generation and transmission. What Dick is conveying is this idea of these microgrids being owned by a variety of people, but being installed to not only serve the local community, but also support the local community if there's not only emergency situations, which they need, but also supply the grid. And the last thing I want to convey, just reinforcing what you're saying, Dick, is that now technology allows customers to do this on their own and does not require the centralized grid to be the only capability. So I just want to stress how your solution will provide a future solution in the marketplace.
Yeah, I don't think there's any one solution. There's solutions, and there are multiple. Some of them are generation, some of them are consumption, some of them are efficiency, some of them are improved line use technologies. We like simple answers, and we had a simple answer for the first 100 years of the grid, and that was a great big power plant far away and a monopoly. We had a combined monopoly of delivery from that central power plant to millions of consumers who had no right to do anything but consume. We're into the internet world of a mainframe in our pocket. We control, and all the peers are communicating back and forth. I come out of the computer telecom industry, and I joined Burroughs, which was a big mainframe company, in 1980. And then I worked in the telecom world as the TCP/IP protocol took over the industry. And now everyone's walking around with a more powerful computer in their pocket than any university ever had in the 70s. And that's local control.
Right. I have to hand this over. I jumped, Lysandra. I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to hand this over to Lysandra.
No worries. And kind of focusing more on Ottawa's climate and urban landscape, which emerging renewable technologies do you think show the most promise for local deployment? And maybe if we can zoom out a bit, which ones do you think in Ontario in general are going to see a bit of a pickup?
Well, local deployment is going to be well, it all hangs on what the regulations allow. In Eastern Ontario, we have a fair bit of sun. Up around Deep River, that's the best place in Ontario for solar. So Obviously, solar is pretty good here, even in the winter if there isn't snow on the panels. But solar production goes up as it gets colder, but it's a shorter day and there is more sun in the wintertime. So solar is good. Wind is good as far as a generation, but that's more regional because of where the wind is. Wind draws opposition that is not always thinking through the need of energy. People assume power comes from a plug in the wall. It comes from somewhere, not the plug. It's just delivered to us in a plug. There would be less opposition to wind if there was more understanding that energy from that turbine was staying local and serving the local people. I made the reference to the farmers in Osgood during the ice storm. If there were pods of 2 or 3 wind turbines with a little bit of solar and a battery, that would be small enough to feed the distribution grid and give us more resiliency here. The government wants to buy megawatts of power because they think there's a need for megawatts. I don't think we need to quadruple our grid the way the pension funds want us to. The big power companies want to scare everybody. They've been scaring us ever since the 70s and missing all their forecasts because electricity growth has not been significant. There's been little bits of electricity growth. David, are you old enough to remember the Porter Commission? Yeah. In 76, Ontario Hydro, which is now bankrupt, I always have to say, asked for money from the Progressive Conservative government at the time for 24 nuclear plants and 18 coal plants. And the government said, you can't do that to us. You'll bankrupt us. So they struck the Porter Commission, did a deep dive into how power was planned and purchased and regulated and controlled, and found that the power companies were doing whatever they wanted to because there had been steady growth of electricity consumption through the 50s, 60s, 70s. But it couldn't keep going that way. So they said for 5 years after the Porter Commission, we did a serious work on energy conservation and started to look at smaller generation. But that all fell apart when the oil prices collapsed in the mid 80s. But we never hit the consumption levels that were predicted. None of those requested big power plants built, the 24 nuclears and the 18. They did build 10 years later, Darlington. That was the first and only nuclear plant built since Bruce and Pickering. Pickering is the oldest nuclear plant in North America. Anyway, electricity consumption hit a peak in 2006. In between, Ontario Hydro went bankrupt because of cost overruns at Darlington. I worked in the computer industry for 25 years, and in that time, electricity consumption did not go up. The energy save feature that was imposed on the computer industry has removed the need for 5 or 6 nuclear plants in the US. All our computers go to sleep at night. There's so much efficiency coming at us from the rest of the world because the rest of the world has higher costs and fewer energy options. North America is cursed and blessed with too many options for energy and low prices. So we're not going to come up with the innovation on efficiency. The rest of the world will, and it'll. So anyway, short answer is we don't need quite as much energy as people say, and we need it closer to consumption points. In Eastern Ontario, the easy thing to do is solar. A little trickier politically is wind and batteries, but they're needed as well. Co-ops have the role of bringing people along and getting people to see that that asset that they're looking at is owned by them. It's not owned by a bank in Toronto. We like banks and pension funds in Toronto, but we'd rather the money stay here, and certainly not owned by pension funds in Dusseldorf or Florida. And the money should be as local as possible. We own the assets that we see where we can. It's not going to be everything cooperatively owned, but right now it's very little. It's not part of the mix at all to any great extent.
Dick, it's actually a really interesting observation you have that we've always had an oversurplus of power. I've been in the industry for many years, over 25 at least. And you're right. We have had a surplus. And I'm going to take your suggestion that we tend to overextend, and maybe that serves the big centralized generation that works to their benefit. I'm going to take that under consideration. It's a great thought process.
David,
Yeah.
Ralph Corey wrote a wonderful article 2 years ago in Corporate Knights and the Globe and Mail on that exact thing. He describes what has happened in the Ontario electricity system in relationship to his age. So in 76, when he was 21 or 2, graduating from Waterloo in physics, that's when the Ontario Hydro folks said, we need all this nuclear and coal. And then he says when he was in his 30s, 40s, 60s, now he's a grandfather. They're doing it again.
And for our viewers, I actually worked at Ontario Hydro and left in 95. So it's kind of interesting observation you have here.
I'll send you the article.
I'm not dispelling what you're saying, by the way. I'm actually quite interested by this. I mean, we could go off, and I won't, but you're hearing the word now because of AI, the incremental power demands. So that will be interesting to see if that actually materializes. Because you got an interesting situation. You have to have a relationship between the utilities and community energy. How does that relationship evolve, and how receptive are you? I mean, you're with Ottawa Hydro primarily, maybe you have some other utilities. How is that evolving as you've seen over the years based on the model you're talking about?
Well, the utilities are constrained by the regulations that they have, and they have to sell. Traditionally, they sell more energy, but I think they should be incented to run their facility as efficiently as possible. That is not necessarily selling more energy, buying it from the provincial grid and delivering it to the end user. There is a lot of talk about moving from local distribution companies, or LDCs, to DSOs, so
Decentralized? Okay.
So regional operators. Think of the IESO broken up into 10 regions. So they're buying and handling the power, making smaller markets of the power. The LDC is not allowed to generate. They can only buy from the grid and sell to the consumer. Ottawa Hydro had to create Portage Power as a separate entity to generate power at the Zibi plant on the Ottawa River, Rideau and Ottawa River, and sell it to the provincial grid, but deliver it within Ottawa. Every LDC has a generation arm that sells to the IESO. We have to have generation and consumption locally. Our relationship with Hydro Ottawa, which is not the only LDC in our territory, we have 5 or 6 or 7, is pretty good, but they are hamstrung, and we are hamstrung by certain parts of the same rules. This is so similar to the telecom industry's transitions from the 80s to the 1990s, 2000. It used to be central phone control, and everyone bought the black telephone on their desk. Sometimes it was painted a different color, but it was the same thing. We're now walking around with phones and filing cabinets and cameras and mainframe computers in our pockets. And the phone companies have done quite well by it. I think that's the transition that we're going to. Our relationship with the LDCs here is pretty good, but we're all hamstrung and trying to figure out what the new rules are going to be. There's a few places in the States that have done major redesigns of their incentive programs from the LDCs. Hawaii apparently is changed from a rate-based guaranteed rate of return to a performance-based program. They're given a pot of money and have to spend within that money and meet performance criteria within that pot of money. That'll get the LDC thinking differently than wanting to spend all the money, right? As their incentive right now as an LDC is to spend more money, get a guaranteed rate of return on building new wires, new transmission stations.
The more assets they get, the more return they get based on those assets. Yeah.
Is that efficient? That's just the way we've done it.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you. I think the model historically on the utility model has to change if we're going to evolve going forward. And I'm interested in that performance piece too, based on efficiency. That's quite an interesting piece too.
That's a difficult change to make. OREC and the other renewable energy co-ops have created a national association called Community Energy Cooperative Canada. and it lobbies at the federal level, but more importantly at the provincial level, because that's where co-op law resides and electricity resides, right? Model is based on Res Co-op in Europe, run out of Brussels, Belgium. We know the head of Res Co-op, Dirk Vincentian, a Belgian fellow. They are lobbying at the EU level and then at every state in Europe. Because in Europe, co-op law and electricity is at the country level. EU sets directives for overall policy and then it gets implemented by each country. So similar to Canada then. So Res Co-op at the EU level has got the EU to pass a directive, and I don't have the directive number in front of me right now, that says every citizen and community in Europe has the right to produce, store, share, save, and benefit financially from their own renewable energy resources. So they can generate, save, store, share, sell, and profit from that. That's illegal in most of Canada. Right? So if that, and that's being implemented differently because every country blames Brussels for all the problems and say, you know, Denmark's different than Belgium, which is different from Italy, then different from Romania. But in the end, they have to coordinate and bend to this. So that's what our ultimate objective would be in some years' time.
Interesting.
For Canada.
Dick, we could go on this forever. I'm going to go on to our next question, not because I think it's really interesting. So, you know, you being renewable, a co-op, but as I conveyed earlier, technology's changed so much that now you have this capacity for energy storage. You can create this generation and then you can store it. So what are the challenges and opportunities you see by integrating energy storage in your renewable cooperative? I see opportunities, but if you can share with us, what are the challenges and maybe opportunities for our audience too?
Well, in Ontario, the province is backtracking from what they said in the past. As many people know, the Liberals ran the province until 18. In 18, the Progressive Conservative government came in. The first thing they did was cancel the feed-in tariff program and canceled 754 contracts. We lost 4 of those contracts and paid out from taxpayer money $230 million in fines and penalties for those cancellations. So those were wind and solar. I don't know if there's any hydro in that, but maybe a little bit of hydro and biogas. Anyway, those contracts were canceled. Some turbines were torn down. And one 500 kilowatt solar field has been sitting built but not connected. So all that money was wasted, and we have gone 7 years without any new generation on the grid. Now we are in a panic because there's new things happening, and we probably will see growth in demand, not to the level that some people are saying. They did do a procurement for LT1 last year for 10 or 12 batteries on the grid, large batteries for the transmission line. The province is going to go through an LT2 procurement and medium-term procurement in the next year. This year, there's LT2, then there'll be a cycle of procurements for the next 5 years, phased in every year. Transmission-oriented, big solar and wind and batteries, which we probably need some of. But I would say we should be doing that on the distribution side first, because that's where the demand is going to be. EVs, heat pumps, and all this industrial stuff. We will be doing big batteries. That's not necessarily what OREC is best suited to do as a community-owned entity. We would prefer to do smaller battery systems at the community size level in front of the meter on the distribution side. Another thing that the province is doing, contradicting what they did when they came in, is they've just announced a big energy retrofit subsidy program. They're going to spend $8 billion over 5 years to help people do energy retrofits, windows, doors, heat pumps, and solar with home batteries. I think I mentioned earlier that they're spending $5.5 billion to encourage people to consume with their Ontario electricity rebate. That's per year. But they're going to spend $8 billion over 5 years to reduce that consumption. So it doesn't quite balance, but it's good that they're doing it. It's very good that they're doing it. So I see the government sees a need for batteries at the home at the small level, which at some point could become virtual power plants. On the transmission side, they're seeing a need for batteries today. There's a market opportunity that we would be well poised to serve, and that is batteries on the distribution side in neighborhoods between those big things on the transmission and those very small things in a home. So we're going from a single way of doing things, big power plants over there, a big drum that's hit and it's heard everywhere, to an orchestra of different instruments synchronizing together in a different way with a more leveled demand profile. Another good thing the province has done in the last year was come up with the ultra-low time of use rate. That was last January. It was actually implemented 7 months later because most of the LDCs had purchased the wrong accounting system. They came up with an ultra-low overnight rate, which also allowed for time of use based on the time value of export. Again, I don't want to get too complicated, but that was a very good thing. And now they're coming up with this subsidy program for solar and battery to use that ultra low time of use rate and the two-way net metering that was adjusted. But those are all ways in which batteries are going to play a better role. And I come back to cooperatives are best suited at the distribution level of the grid, which is not thought of as a generation area. It's thought of as a one-way supply through an LDC whose job and mandate is restricted to delivering power in one direction. And that's a core problem for all of us.
Okay. Lots of depth on that one, Dick. There's lots of stuff. And you and I have done this for a while, so I'm hoping there'll be lots of questions from our listeners based on this conversation. Let's get into one of my final questions. When you look at how do renewable cooperatives really help accelerate building electrification and reduce natural gas dependence, Dick? How do you see that?
I guess a simple way is we're a community of friends, neighbors, and we share that knowledge. If we are going to go through this massive energy transition and massive explosion of electrification, that can't be pushed down on us by a government or financed by Bay Street or Wall Street. Much of it will be, but there has to be an understanding by voters and citizens in a neighborhood that this new asset that's being put there is going to serve that neighborhood and the people around it. Not just the farmer who's getting the wind turbine. It has to serve the person that's looking at the wind turbine, for example. So my wind turbine looks better than one owned by a bank in Dusseldorf. And when I started in this business in 2009, I went to a conference in Toronto where a German credit union banker said that he loved lending to the energy co-ops in northern Germany because in that area there's lots of wind, so they were mostly wind energy co-ops. He said, this is 2009. Remember what happened in 2008? There was a world financial crisis, and he said to the audience, I love lending money to renewable energy co-ops because I know that if something goes wrong, I won't hear about it. The lady who's down the road from the turbine and sees that it's not moving will call that co-op and get on his case to call the co-op's president and get on his case to get that asset going because it's paying her mortgage. So he had never had a bad loan with an energy co-op. I don't know if that's still the case, but there wasn't a banker in the room who could have said that about most of their loans at the time. So ownership changes the view of things.
And effectively, as we started the discussion, electrification will start taking the place of some of the fossil fuel, whether you're talking about heat pumps or things of that nature from natural gas, right? That's kind of where this is going.
Yeah. I think so. And we have set up a series of talks called the OREC talks, where we present different things to our members. We don't earn anything from that. It's just information sharing. And we've also set something up on our internal website called ORECs, with an X at the end, Community Exchange, where members post their EVs, heat pumps, water heater and HVAC, solar generation assets, battery assets, and one person actually has a wind asset at his home. We only started that up a few months ago. We now have 61 members who've posted something. We have 173 distributed energy assets listed. And I know there's another 8 or 10 members that haven't posted their solar assets. The big advantage for the politicians is we can bring people together to share information and educate one another. I'm pretty sure we have the highest concentration of 1,000 people in Ontario that have solar, wind, EVs, heat pumps. Our friends at Hydro Ottawa and Hydro One are very interested because they need early adopters. We are naturally inclined to draw interest from early adopters on this.
Well, this has been a great episode and very educational, Dick. To end this off, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I wish I was 40. There's going to be so much change and opportunity in the next 20 years. The telecom computer industry is going to look like a little change.
Thanks for that takeaway. Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
I think the biggest thing that I've captured, and I think we've conveyed this so many times, but Dick has come about it a different way, is most people don't think about energy, certainly in North America. We just take it for granted. And Dick has conveyed that if consumers actually participate and own, not only own it, but own in developing solutions, not only does it make them more efficient, but they can prosper from it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's really been conveyed. It's always like, no, don't talk like you don't have to worry about, you don't have to think about this. And I think this model that Dick's talking about, where customers are actually involved and engaged and makes things better. I am hopeful, Dick, that what you're conveying will be the future, because I think it will spread and everyone can benefit associated with it. And not that I'm I just think there's just huge opportunity as you've explained, but it just needs to be understood. Rules and policies have to be put in place, which may be somewhat daunting or challenging. Some people don't want this to happen. The analogy of the telecom and versus the energy industry is a great analogy because that's happened so quickly. So we'll see what happens. Lysandra, how about you? What have you captured from this?
You know, I think it's really interesting because the way we've always kind of talked about the electricity industry is it is a market, but the way you're describing it is definitely more of a flexible market. And I like the perspective of shareholders actually caring about it rather than it being something on the side. I think that perspective is very unique. I don't think we've heard that one quite yet here. And I actually do work at a utility. So when I listen to you talk about all of these things, I do see the parallels, and I do see, I'm curious to see in the next decade what the energy industry looks like. And especially in Ontario, I'm curious to see what gets pushed out of the ISO and the OEB as we move to a more innovative industry. I think currently, the way we operate, we're just so dependent on centralized power. And I think that the community is in for a bit of a shock.
Dick, you and I won't be around, but you watch Lysandra make that happen.
I think it's a fascinating future, and it doesn't have to be run by the shareholders. It can be run not completely, but to a greater extent by the homeowners. In urban centers, by the apartment dwellers and condo livers, people living in those shared facilities. If we own it, it looks a lot different.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for your time.
Thank
you. And thanks for a great conversation.
Thanks so much, Dick. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a real pleasure. I hope I didn't go on too much.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn post. See you next week.